Paul could get to the racetrack because he used to say, when I'm at my fastest, Mum, he says, I'm flying. Jack had an outlet with music. Hundreds of people used to hear him play the trumpet because he made people feel something.
From the very beginning of your relationship, there was repeated coercive control by your ex-husband.
He'd gone from being totally nice, caring, to a sudden tirade. I'd taken them to school that morning, and as always, I said to them, love you, and they replied to infinity and beyond. But then at 6:30, there was a knock on the door, and call it instinct, call it a mother's instinct, didn't want to answer the door. They didn't come through that door. And I opened the door and there was a local police officer stood on the step and a police car with the blue lights flashing in the middle of the road. And I just knew, and I said, what has he done?
Welcome to my podcast, Tidballzy. It's the first episode in hopefully a long series, and this podcast is about brave stories and bold ideas. So where better to start than my incredible constituent, Claire Throssell MBE. She began her campaign 11 years ago after the tragic death of her two boys, Jack and Paul, following a house fire set alight by her ex-husband, a known domestic abuser. Claire, thank you so much for joining us today. And we met at Penistone Grammar School, the school that Jack and I both went to at a remembrance event where you every year get up and make sure that you put a wreath on a tree in the grounds there. Can you tell me about that first meeting that we had?
It was a meeting, and I remember meeting you and thinking, wow, what an amazing lady. You made you made sure that I wasn't alone at the tree. You kept me company. You cared. And at a point where I got no hope left and was constantly battling, not having my voice heard, going through Parliament after Parliament, to meet you and see that your dedication and the fact that you cared personally was just such a lift. And I had a feeling as soon as we met that good things were going to happen. And then you made a promise to me that if you were elected, you would help me to fulfill the promise that I made to my boys. And it's just incredible, the journey that we've been on since then. 2 years of fighting, battling, and to finally have it within touching distance is just incredible.
Absolutely, and we'll come back to that promise and where that's taken us to this week towards the end of the programme. But I just want to go back now to the beginning, and I've read your book, For My Boys, telling your story. And at the start, there was repeated coercive control by your ex-husband from the very beginning of your relationship, with him giving you a single red rose every single day. Can you just reflect on that and all the signs that at the time you hadn't necessarily seen, but became so tragically evident throughout the course of your relationship?
Yeah, back in 1996 when I met him, gaslighting wasn't a thing, neither was love bombing. And now we know that sending a rose every day is love bombing. We can push it even further and say it's stalking. He found out which store I worked in and sent a rose every day, but it makes you fall into a trap because it makes you truly believe that they really, really do want to spend time with you. They really, really do admire you. And this is the thing. They can keep this up for up to 6 years. So by the time that the mask slips, you're already committed to them. You could have children with them, have a house together. Looking back, all the signs were there. The coercive control, making me feel how he felt, making me think that only he could give me that attention, that time. They create a bubble, but then this bubble pops.
And it began to pop really early, didn't it? And, you know, you were and had seen those signs from quite early on, you know, reading the book, the moment that you talk about with the motorbike, and I'll get you to reflect on that. But the scene on the beach in Cornwall with the beach ball, I mean, can you take us to that moment where you were on that beach? Because all your family were around and they were all observing that.
Yeah, it came out of nowhere, this sudden outburst, because I'd picked a beach ball up and it had got seabird poo on it. And they were just laughing at me and he was making a big deal out of it. So I just took a tiny bit of that and put it on his t-shirt and he went absolutely ballistic.
I think you washed it in a rock pool, didn't you?
Yeah.
You washed this beach ball in a rock pool after he'd ordered you to do so, and then you threw it to him because you couldn't get the last bits off, and then it marked the t-shirt.
Yeah.
And he was vile in his language towards you in that moment, wasn't he?
Absolutely, calling me all sorts of names, and he just flipped. He'd gone from being totally nice, caring, to a sudden tirade of abuse, and everybody was like, what on earth? And the way he just flipped around and made it so humiliating for me was just really terrible. And those were the first signs to me that things weren't right. The fact that he wouldn't let me back in the tent until I'd taken it to a laundrette and got this t-shirt clean for him. The fact that I slept on the floor that night and he slept on the airbed. It was all designed to humiliate and make me feel like a piece of dirt underneath his shoe.
But moving forward, as you say, that love bombing continued, that coercive control continued, and you reached a point where you had the two boys in quite quick succession with each other. Can you tell me about the layers of abuse then that began to be laced through Jack and Paul's childhood?
It started with small insults. It started with a few phone calls, the coercive control. Oh, don't go out with your friends tonight. I'll make something special for you. You stay in, you tell your friends that you can't go out with them. And nothing special does happen that night, but they've controlled you, and then they turn around and gaslight and say, well, I didn't stop you from going out. I didn't say you couldn't go out, but actually they did. And you're feeling, well, you stopped me from going out, and now you're saying, well, you didn't.
But the layers of abuse that were laced through Jack and Paul's childhood, I mean, some of those moments were horrific. The neglect with the dog bites on Jack's arm.
Yeah, I'd gone to work the one few occasion that he had Jack on his own, and I got a phone call to say that Jack had been bitten and he was going up to the doctors, and there was all this drama. And I said, well, where's he been bitten? Oh, I haven't got time to tell you that now. So you rang me to scare me. And then I said, well, how has he got bitten? He doesn't get bitten when I'm looking after him. We were in a shop, but what had actually happened was he'd left Jack unattended in that shop, wandered off around the shop, started talking to the very pretty sales assistant, forgot all about Jack. Jack had gone up to this dog and it bit him, but it clamped onto his wrist, and he absolutely screamed. And then he was like, well, you're at work. So there again, the blame then was on me, and it was like, well, it's your fault because I had to look after him because you were at work.
And then the layers of abuse on top of that built and built and built to the point that Jack's secondary school actually reported their concerns to social services. So Jack being watching his brother Paul being forced to eat peas until he was sick, Paul being forced to eat his crusts and then pulled by the shirt and tie of his school uniform and then slammed back down in a chair. There's incident after incident after incident. And then you reached a point and a critical point of leaving the home after not long after you'd been pushed down the stairs, when you'd stood in the way of your ex-husband's fist as he went to hit your son Jack. So you left the family home to get away, to get your boys out of that situation. You went to live with your mum. And there are some beautiful moments in the book that you talk about where you'd take the boys on day trips to Blackpool and other places. What were the boys' characters like when they were away from this environment of abuse?
They finally felt they could breathe again. They finally felt they could be children, even if they were winding each other up or pushing and shoving each other. We went to Lytham St Anne's, and Paul just threw himself into the paddling pool fully clothed, and he's laid back. And I'm like, what on earth? And he just said, because I could, Mum, because I could. They felt that they were at peace. They could be whoever they wanted to be. Jack loved to play the trumpet. Paul was a runner. He'd run across the sand, and they were just allowed to be children. They were just allowed to be themselves. And to see them, I'm so glad that they had their passions. I'm so glad that they had outlooks during the short lives. I'm glad that Paul could get to the racetrack, because he used to say, when I'm at my fastest, Mum, he says, I'm flying. He says it's the closest thing to flying, because when you reach optimum speed, all your limbs are off the floor, everything's going in speed motion. And he just said he was free. He was flying free. Jack had an outlet with music. Hundreds of people used to hear him play the trumpet because he made people feel something. When he played, he touched people's hearts.
I mean, it's very poignant for me to hear you talk about this, because I know music's been such an important part of your family life. Your dad set up the Millhouse Green Male Voice Choir, and Jack is named after your dad. So it's such a beautiful thread to have run through their very early special parts of their lives where they were free, where they were away from their dad. But the courts then came into place when you were going through that process of separating from your ex-husband and working out who should get to see your sons when. And despite the layers of abuse that you've described already, being known to social services, being known to CAFCAS, your ex-husband held the CAFCAS officer trapped in an office that was very weak, that your sons died. Despite all that, because of the presumption of contact, your two boys were ordered by the court to see your ex-husband for 5 hours a week on unsupervised contact visits. I hope you're enjoying this episode. I want to also say a big thank you to Women's Aid for all the work that they've done campaigning alongside Claire over the last decade. If you haven't already, do pick up a copy of Claire's book, For My Boys. It's an incredibly moving read. If you're interested in sponsoring this podcast, please go to tidballzy.com. So that leads us to 2014 and the night that they tragically lost their lives. And that night started with a knock at the door. So take us through what happened then.
It did. I'd missed them by 5 minutes because he picked them up late that night. It's weird because I'd taken them to school that morning, and as always, I said to them, love you. And they replied to infinity and beyond. Their favourite films were Toy Story. In fact, Toy Story had a lot to answer for. But then at 6:30, there was a knock on the door. And call it instinct, call it a mother's instinct, didn't want to answer the door. And my mum said, oh, that's the boys, they'll be back early. And I said, no, because if it had been, they'd have run through the door, they'd have run into my arms, because they were always scared, and I'd have to scaffold and reassure and make them feel better. They didn't come through that door. And I opened the door, and there was a local police officer stood on the step, and a police car with the blue lights flashing in the middle of the road. And I just knew, and I said, what has he done? And he stepped into the light, and we're a small village. He knew me. Paul would go to the same school as his son, so we'd say good morning to each other every day. And he said, there's been an incident at the house and you need to come with me now. Jack and Paul's been taken to Sheffield Children's Hospital and they're very sick. So I went in the blues and twos, and by the time I got to Sheffield Children's Hospital, I was feeling really sick. I don't know if it was the ride there or the fact that I knew that they were seriously ill. But he did a handbrake turn in the resus department and he went, go, go, go. So I ran through, and as I ran through the doors, I saw Paul being on a bed receiving CPR, and it was brutal. His little body was literally bouncing off that bed. A doctor said to me, are you Paul's mum? And I said, yes. And he said to me, we're going to let him go now. And I said, go where? And then it connected, and I said, no, you can't do that. And he said, come with me. So we went through, and all the doctors were still working on him. And then they stopped doing CPR and handed him to me and put him in my arms. It was the tightest I'd ever held him that night, and I lost him. I held him so tight and my tears were making his hair wet. And I said, come on, Paul, you've got to stay. And he looked at me and the light just went out of his eyes. His eyes just glazed over, and those beautiful blue eyes just went still, just went grey. And I just kept holding tight to him, holding tight, tight, tight. And then a nurse came and closed his eyes. They let me hold him for about 1 more minute. And then they said, you have to let him come to us now because it's a crime scene. It wasn't a crime scene, he was my boy.
That's so hard.
So I was holding tight to him, and I was almost like shielding him, and I curled my body up so that he was curled up here so nobody could take him out my arms. It took 3 police officers to get him out my arms. And it sounds really bad, but I'd not even thought about Jack till that moment. Jack was still fighting, and they said to me that he was hanging on, but they'd had to do open surgery because he'd been burnt. Now, Paul just looked perfect. He just looked like he was sleeping. He got a tiny graze down his nose. Jack was completely bandaged up. His thick hair was sticking out of the bandages. And I said, I'm here, Jack. And his heartbeat went really calm. And I said, what's happened? And they said, well, he's 56% burnt.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, how? How has this happened? And my sister was the first person. She said, he'll have been protecting Paul. He'll have been protecting his brother. He actually did more than protect his brother. He tried to save his brother's life. 2 hours later, we got the call through that my ex-husband, who had been taken to Barnsley Hospital, had just suddenly passed away. And I remember being so angry because I wanted him to face justice. I wanted him to face what he'd done. And then came the biggest chest slam, because I was told that Jack needed to go to Manchester to the intensive care unit because his burns were so serious and he needed immediate surgery to save his life. I've never chose between Jack and Paul. You love each child the same, even though they've got different personalities. And I had to make the decision to leave Paul in Sheffield and go with Jack to Manchester. I went into the room to say goodbye to Paul, and he was lying underneath the sheet. And I said to the nurse, don't leave him on his own, he's only 9, he can't be left alone. And the nurse promised to sit with him. And not only did the nurse sit with him, the police guarded him as well for 5 days and kept my promise that they would look after him. I went to Manchester and Jack hung on for 5 days.
Wow.
And in those 5 days, we found out that he'd set 14 separate fires with
his
petrol
dad. His dad.
in the home. He'd gone up to the attic. He'd lured them up to the attic with a train set and sweets. And he'd gone up to join them. But he'd barricaded the house and locked the house so that he had made absolutely certain, and the police were very clear about this, that they could not get out. They could not escape. And I think, did he taunt them? Did he tell them in the attic that they were going to die? They would have heard and smelt the flames below. But Jack made a decision and they ran away. They ran towards the edge of the hatchway, but Paul fell because of the smoke. And Jack chose to go back for his brother. He gave him his hand, he gave him his strength, and he pulled him to the edge of the hatchway. But because he was going backwards, he fell through the hatch and into the flames below. And that's how he got injured. And even though he was overcome by the smoke and he got these burns and he couldn't breathe, he used the last of his strength, the last of his breath, to tell as many people as he could in that property that his dad had done this and he'd done it on purpose.
This is when the firemen came.
All he could think about was everybody else apart from himself. He thought he'd saved Paul's life, and for 5 days, because he was only sedated, I was told to speak about Paul in the present tense. And Jack lost his life in my arms 5 days later, believing he'd saved the life of his brother, because I never told him different. I let him die, believing he'd saved his brother's life. They'll know now because they're together, but at the time it was more important for them, for him to believe he'd done the right thing.
And I mean, it's just absolutely tragic. And the bravery of your two boys in the episode that you describe have been reflected in your bravery after they passed away over the last 11 years. But tell me a bit about the impact that their deaths has had on you and your life in the period since.
My life ended. There were 3 lives taken that night because I just exist. And I exist to make sure that the last promise that I made to Jack when he was dying in my arms is fulfilled. I held him tight, just like I did Paul, and I promised him that no other child should have to die at the hands of somebody they should be able to love and know that they protect them. Nobody should be betrayed by a parent. No other child should have had to say to a fireman, to a doctor, to a police officer, and that to become a dying testimony that a parent has hurt them and done it on purpose.
And this was after Paul had said to some of those officials, including social services, that his dad was capable of killing. So how does that make you feel that despite the warnings you gave everybody, despite the school alerting social services, despite the words of your sons that were given in evidence, that were made available to the courts, that nevertheless they were placed with their dad, a known domestic abuser? I mean, where do you go from there, Claire? How have you managed over the last 11 years to find that strength and to keep fighting for your boys, but also for children up and down this country?
Love. Love for Jack and Paul, and then an anger, because the very first mistake that was made, I said to the officer that was doing the serious case review that they must name Jack and Paul. I said they are never a child A, they are never a child B, and they are definitely not going to be anonymised and put into a serious case review just to gather dust in a file in Whitehall. And the very first thing they did was make them a child A and a child B. But also they said they could not predict harm. Let's not forget, I shouted it from the rooftops that he was capable of killing Jack and Paul. Jack and Paul had said loud and clear they didn't want to see him. They were frightened of him and they'd been hurt by him in the past. All the incidents that were racking up. You know, Paul never forgot the feeling of his shirt being pulled tight across his neck Jack never forgot being kicked at the back of his legs to fall over or being called a crybaby. All of this was there. And the fact that they were on a court-ordered visit that they never returned from, it's not right.
Absolutely.
We were all invisible. So I was then told that I couldn't challenge the serious case review. So I was just being brushed off and brushed off. I went to the inquest and the coroner said, it's not your fault. Try saying that when they know that Jack and Paul only died because he wanted to punish me. And everybody around this case allowed that to happen. But I sent them on that last visit. I didn't stop them going on that last visit.
But Claire, you couldn't stop them going on that last visit. That was something the court had permitted to happen against your advice, against your warnings, against the preferences and the choices of your boys. And you cannot carry that around with you. You spent the last 11 years fighting for other children's futures and for other parents that have been in a similar situation to you. And you started that work with Women's Aid. And you've spent a long time working with them on this campaign that they've had for 30 years to repeal the presumption of contact in law. And what's that been like over such a long time, over a decade since they passed away?
Women's Aid were the first turning point because they reached out, gave me their hand, they gave me my dignity back, they gave me a platform to fight. They met me in a cafe in 2016. It was pouring down with rain in Sheffield. And I was walking into this cafe and I thought, I don't know what these two people look like, but they knew instantly what I looked like. And we had a hug. And instantly I knew, a bit like when I met you, that good things could happen. They had the same vibe. They had the same passion. And they said to me that Jack and Paul were child 18, 19 on the second report. And I started bristling up and I said, they are not a child 18, they are not a child 19. And they basically said to me, then front this campaign, make sure Jack and Paul are named because all the other children, we can't.
And you managed to do that working with Jess Phillips. You got their names spoken in Parliament. Tell me about that moment.
That was just incredible. The fact that Jess supported the campaign and was there when I handed the petition in. We started a petition called the Child First campaign, and the aim obviously is to stop presumption of contact. We went to Downing Street and Jess was there, and then Jess stood up in Parliament and led a debate alongside my MP at the time, Angela Smith, and she got the domestic abuse bill through. And that was through Jess's determination. But to hear their names after all those years of just being a child A, child B, sat in the gallery listening to Jess say their names and then making Theresa May say their names and Robert Buckland, it was just incredible. And I shouldn't have had to fight that much to name them. It breaks my heart that 66 children now are still A's and B's. At the time we had 20 children and they couldn't name them in the House of Commons. But they could name Jack and Paul. And I think if I've done anything, all these people in Whitehall that look at serious case reviews, they now have two faces to put to those serious case reviews. Children, lives, and it makes them
characters.
Yeah. It makes them human. What Jack did, he's never a child A. I mean, all his friends used to say to me, he makes our world a better place just by being in it. Well, he made my world a better place 24 hours a day. Even though he could wind me up and push me to my limits, he was just mine. And it's such a privilege to say that I was his mum.
And I think what's been so powerful about your campaign and all the work that you've done is Jack and Paul have been at the forefront, and you know, you've channeled that grief and the trauma of what happened at that time into doing a piece of work to honour their lives so that they weren't lost in vain. But you've also made sure that it's clear that this is, in total, 68 children have lost their lives on court-permitted contact visits because of the presumption of contact since Women's Aid started their campaign. We know that 90% of cases reviewed by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner in 2025 found that there was domestic abuse in those Kafkas cases. So what does that feel like? What would you say to people in explaining why we have to repeal the presumption?
Firstly, presumption has no place in a court of law. Presumption has no place when it comes to the safety of children, and it has no place when it comes to children's lives. It's not for a stranger, a judge, to take 2 snapshots of children's lives from Kafkas, from social services, from unregulated experts. It's not for a judge to just take this snapshot and make a decision, because those decisions are perpetually costing lives. Year after year, we've had children die because of decisions made in a courtroom based on presumption. Contact should never be at contact at any cost.
Absolutely.
We have far too many cases. In my case, the judge said we need a Section 7 report. Now, a Section 7 report is when a judge suspects domestic abuse is in play, but they still ordered unsupervised contact. My concerns, my words at best were ignored, and at worst called hysterical, spiteful, said to make his character look bad. I was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Jack and Paul were telling the truth, but we were all invisible until it was too late.
But all those years later, over a decade of fighting, on the 11th anniversary of their deaths, just reflecting back on the promise that you made to your boys that their lives would not be lost in vain, and then the promise that I made when we first met that if I was elected as your Member of Parliament, I would work with you and fight until we changed the law. Then on the 11th anniversary of their deaths in October last year, you and I went to Downing Street and you met the 6th Prime Minister since they tragically lost their lives. We sat in the terracotta room. Tell me what happened. How did that feel?
To walk into number 10 and walk up that staircase, I did it once before at a reception, and it felt like an absolute mountain to climb those steps. In fact, I had to have the feel of Jack and Paul's hands on my shoulder to get up those stairs, because the level of expectation, the pressure of what I wanted was overwhelming. To walk into number 10 and be able to A, hold my head up, B, look people in the eye, because for years I didn't feel worthy enough to look people in the eye. I felt like having to apologise to everybody for breathing the same air as them. When you've been made to feel like a piece of dirt underneath the whole world's shoe, the abuse doesn't stay with the abuser, it stays with us. And there's always a part of me that says, who am I to go in these places? Who am I to challenge these people? But walking in with you and Alex, and
that's Alex
Farah,
Davis-Jones,
Alex
the minister.
Davis-Jones, it gave me confidence, and I could finally say we're making a difference. So we walked up the staircase, and last time I had to imagine Hugh Grant going across the staircase in the film Love Actually. This time I could look and stand as myself, didn't have to do that, and that's a huge step forward. Walked into the room, wasn't expecting to sit next to the Prime Minister.
He gave you a big hug when he came in, didn't he? Yeah.
He did.
Yeah.
And for somebody to look me in the eye and say that he would repeal presumption of contact, to recognise my bravery. Is it bravery? No, I'm just a grieving mum that's trying to make a difference, always have been. People don't see the days when I sit at the back with my back to a wall thinking, how do I get through the next minute? How do I get through the next day without them. To speak to him and know that Jack and Paul had been not just heard, but seen, that he believed and supported me, it meant the world, because all we want as victims is to be seen, heard, believed, supported and protected. Get that right and we'll get rid of abuse. And more importantly, we'll save lives.
And he did hear you, and he did believe you, and he did see you. And he said he was going to take my promise to you on, and he was going to make sure that was put in legislation. And here we have the Courts and Tribunals Bill, and Jack and Paul's Law, Clause 17 of this bill, which is going through Parliament and gone through Parliament this week. How has this week felt?
Bittersweet. Presumption was introduced just before I started accessing the family courts, and there's always that what if for them. But to know that children of not just today, not just tomorrow, but for generations to come, have a better chance, have a better outcome, that their futures won't be presumed, their safety won't be presumed. No judge will be saying, we're going to issue contact and hope for the best. To know that children will be seen and heard, believed and supported, but more importantly, protected. Nobody's got a right to take their childhood and dismantle it piece by piece by piece. It's hard when parents separate, but it's even harder when they're abusing because they can. This repeal says you can't. This repeal throws a gauntlet down, throws a challenge to all the perpetrators out there, that we are going to challenge them, we are going to stop them from continuing this abuse day after day after day to children. Having a child is a privilege, but it's not a right.
Absolutely.
And anybody who abuses their child should not have automatic contact. It's not a right. Their parental rights should never come above the rights of a child. And every child deserves to live, and every child deserves a childhood free, safe, and safe from harm.
Well, Claire, it has been a huge privilege to talk to you today. I am and will forever be grateful for your persistence in the face of your great loss of your two beautiful boys, your ability to keep going in every single hurdle that then came at you over the last more than a decade, and your strength more than anything to do that, because getting up every day and deciding that you wanted to honour the lives of your boys by changing the law in the way that you have is an incredible achievement and absolutely outstanding. And it has been a great privilege for me to get to work with you as your MP, and now I hope we can say friend as well. So thank you so much for telling your story today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Tidballzy. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe or give a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.